May 13th, 1945. The war is over. Germany surrendered 5 days ago. The guns went quiet. And inside an abandoned Ford factory on the outskirts of Amsterdam, a German firing squad is lining up their rifles. The targets are not Allied soldiers. They are 2 German sailors, their own men, their own navy. And the war is already done. This is the story of what German soldiers did to each other when the Third Reich finally collapsed. Not what the Allies did to them, what they did to themselves. And it is one of the most disturbing, most documented, and most buried stories from the last days of World War II. To understand it, you have to understand what Germany looked like by 1945. It was not an army retreating in good order. It was a machine eating its own parts to keep running. Fanaticism replacing strategy. Terror replacing command. And at the center of it all, one rule that Hitler had been enforcing since 1939. The soldier can die, but the deserter must die. That was not a metaphor. That was policy. It was carved into the Wehrmacht's legal code from the very beginning of the war. And by 1945, after 6 years of conflict had ground down over 11 million German soldiers, killing roughly 5 million of them and sending millions more into captivity, the men enforcing that policy were running out of enemies to shoot. So they started shooting each other with increasing speed and increasingly without any paperwork at all. The number of Germans who actually tried to leave is staggering when you look at the full arc of the war. Desertion was rare in 1939, rarer still in 1940 when Germany was winning. But after Stalingrad fell in February 1943, after the disaster in North Africa in May of the same year, after D-Day and the collapse of Army Group Center in the summer of 1944, the number of men walking away from their units began climbing fast. The Wehrmacht's own records, incomplete as they are, show over 22,500 soldiers sentenced to death for desertion across the entire war. Of those, an estimated 15,000 were actually executed by official court-martial. The rest died in military prisons or had their sentences commuted to penal battalion service, which was functionally a slower death sentence. You were sent to the most dangerous assignments with the least equipment, and the clear understanding that survival was not the Army's concern. If you value documented history like this, that most people never get to hear, subscribe right now. It is the best way to support the work we do here. And drop a comment telling us what city you are watching from. This script is researched and factual, drawing primarily from Chris Madsen's peer-reviewed 1993 article in the Canadian Military History Journal titled Victims of Circumstance, and from the German historical research compiled by Manfred Messerschmitt and Fritz Willner in their 1987 study of Wehrmacht justice, which was the first major work to challenge the official German execution figures. These are not casual sources. These are the people who cracked open the sealed files. Now back to the story. Between 1939 and 1945, the Wehrmacht executed somewhere between 13,000 and 15,000 of its own soldiers for violations of military law. That number comes from court records. But here is the problem with that number. It does not count the last months of the war, when they stopped keeping records. German historians Messerschmitt and Willner argued in their 1987 study that when you include the extrajudicial killings, the ones with no trial at all, the real number is closer to 30,000. Some estimates go even higher. In World War I, the German army executed 48 soldiers. 48. By World War II, the same army was executing that many in days. The machine that enforced this was called the Feldgendarmerie, the field military police. Soldiers called them Kettenhunde, chained dogs. They wore a metal gorget around their necks, a neck plate with a chain, the symbol of their authority to stop any man, demand his papers, and decide on the spot whether he lived or died. By 1943, when the defeats at Stalingrad and North Africa broke the myth of German invincibility, the Feldgendarmerie were everywhere. Rear roads, train stations, field hospitals, anywhere a soldier might try to slip away from a front that was now moving backwards. They were not looking for criminals. They were looking for anyone who looked like they were giving up. That was enough. Then came the flying courts, the Fliegende Sonderstandsgericht. Hitler officially authorized them on March 8, 1945, less than 8 weeks before the end of the war in Europe. Flying because they moved. Special because they answered to no one except Hitler himself. These were mobile execution units that traveled with their own firing squads. The judge was the prosecutor. The verdict was always the same. In 1966, the German magazine Der Spiegel began investigating how many men these courts killed. The estimates range from 5,000 to 8,000 men, executed by their own army in the final months alone. Some German researchers believe even that number is too low. The most famous single use of a flying court happened before that official authorization. March 7, 1945. The American 9th Armored Division is pushing toward the Rhine. Remagen. A railroad bridge built during World War I, called the Ludendorff Bridge, is still standing. The Americans are stunned. It should have been blown. The orders were clear. But inside the bridge, a confusion of command structures, wrong explosives, and split authority has left the detonators connected, but misfiring. Captain Karl Friesenhahn twists the ignition handle. Nothing. He tries again. Still nothing. The Germans had requested 600 kilograms of military-grade explosives. They received 300 kilograms of Donnerit, a weak mining explosive used in quarries, less than half the power they needed. The Americans charge across. Sergeant Alexander Drabek from Holland, Ohio, is the first man over. Hitler hears the news and goes into a controlled rage. He fires Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt on the spot, replacing him with Albert Kesselring, who describes the situation as nearly catastrophic. Then Hitler calls for the flying court. On March 10th, he personally appoints Lieutenant General Rudolf Hübner to run what becomes the Fliegendes Sonderstandgericht West, Flying Special Court Martial West. Hübner is described in contemporary records as a fanatical and reliable Nazi. He has no legal training. He travels to Army Group B headquarters with 2 military policemen who serve him as his execution squad. When Army Group B's own legal officer, Colonel Jennert, offers Hübner a copy of the German Military Code of Justice, Hübner waves it aside. He says the only authority he needs is Hitler's. On March 11th, Major Hans Scheller is brought before the court. Scheller had arrived at the Remagen Bridge at 11:15 in the morning on the day of its capture. He had been in command for less than 2 hours when the Americans attacked. He did not know the town. He did not know the troops. He had been sent by General Hitzfeld to take over a chaotic situation with no briefing. When the bridge failed to explode and American soldiers started crossing the span, Scheller got on a bicycle and rode to the rear to report to headquarters. That bicycle ride is what kills him. The court rules it desertion of his post. Lieutenant Karl-Heinz Peters is tried the same morning. Peters was not even part of the bridge garrison. He was passing through, trying to get his experimental anti-aircraft rocket battery across the Rhine before American forces captured it. He had pleaded with Scheller for a few extra minutes to get his secret Henschel rocket system to safety. Scheller had agreed. Peters is convicted of allowing classified weapons to fall into enemy hands. The verdict for both men is death. They are taken into the woods near Rimbach in the Westerwald, shot in the back of the neck, buried in shallow graves where they fell. They are 32 and in their 20s, respectively. Their families' pension rights are revoked immediately. On the same day, Majors Herbert Strobel and August Kraft are summoned to Field Marshal Model's headquarters in Oberirsen. They have no idea why. Within hours, they too are facing Hübner's court. Same process, same outcome. Shot in the woods, buried in Oberirsen. Captain Willy Bratke, the actual bridge commander who had been captured by the Americans, is sentenced to death in his absence. He never faces execution because he is a prisoner of war. Captain Karl Friesenhahn, the one who twisted the ignition handle and got nothing, is acquitted. The court accepts that he did everything he could. 4 men shot. 1 sentenced while safely in American custody. 1 acquitted. That is German military justice in 1945. Berlin, April 16th, 1945. Stalin launches the final offensive. 20 armies, 6,300 tanks, 8,500 aircraft, and 2.5 million Soviet soldiers begin moving toward the German capital. Inside the city, there are roughly 45,000 German military personnel, supplemented by 24,000 Volkssturm, the last-ditch civilian militia. These are old men, teenage boys, and the physically unfit. Some of them are armed with World War I-era rifles. Some have Panzerfaust rocket launchers they have never fired in their lives. They are not ready for what is coming. Most of them know it. The Volkssturm itself had been created by Hitler's decree in September 1944. Every male between 16 and 60 who was not already in uniform was conscripted into it. They received a 48-hour training program. 48 hours. Then they were handed whatever weapons were available, a mix of antique Gewehr rifles from the 1890s, captured Soviet and British arms, and the Volkssturmgewehr, a cheap stamped metal rifle barely reliable enough to fire. Battalion 25/235 of the Volkssturm entered the Battle of Berlin with 400 men. 10 walked out. That is a 97.5% casualty rate. At Breslau, roughly 1,900 Volkssturm men died. At Königsberg, another 2,400 were killed. These were not soldiers who had years of training and combat experience. Many were men in their 50s and boys in their mid-teens being thrown at 2.5 million battle-hardened Soviet troops who had been fighting east to west since Stalingrad. The SS knows it too, and that makes them more dangerous to their own side than the Soviets. Goebbels broadcasts a proclamation over the radio to the trapped soldiers of Berlin. Any man found not doing his duty will be hanged from a lamppost after a summary judgment. Placards will be attached to the corpses. The signs read, in German, "I have been hanged here because I am too cowardly to defend the capital of the Reich. I have been hanged because I did not believe in the Führer. I am a deserter, and for this reason I shall not see this turning point in history." They meant it. The SS patrols that enforced this order were operating under a specific logic. They knew their blood type tattoos, mandatory for all SS members, would identify them to Allied forces after the war. They had nothing to lose by fighting, and everything to lose by surrendering. So they enforced fanaticism on everyone else. Boys found hiding were pulled from basements and cellars and hanged as traitors. When trees were not available, they used lampposts. Witnesses described walking through Berlin streets in late April 1945 and seeing bodies hanging from poles with cardboard signs around their necks. Military men, civilian men, women. Anyone the patrols decided looked like they were giving up. One German eyewitness account, recorded by Radio Free Europe's archives, published in a 2005 report marking the 60th anniversary of the end of the war, described SS units moving through Munich, Cologne, Hamburg, and Berlin, screening refugees and hospital transports for deserters. The old Wehrmacht military police, the Feldgendarmerie, were renamed Heldenklauer by ordinary Germans, hero snatchers. Because that is what they did. They snatched men out of retreating columns, out of field hospitals, and shot them in ditches if their paperwork was wrong or their wounds looked self-inflicted. In Munich on April 27, 1945, 3 days before Hitler killed himself in the Führer bunker, a group of civilians occupied the town hall and arrested the Nazi mayor. They were trying to surrender the city without a fight to save lives. The SS sent 3 full companies from the nearby Dachau concentration camp garrison to crush them. The poorly armed civilians were no match. Many were captured. Many were shot or hanged on the spot. The Volkssturm Battalion 25/235 started the final battle with 400 men. By the time it was over, 10 remained. Now go back 5 days after the German surrender. May 13th, 1945. 150,000 German soldiers have surrendered in the Netherlands to a much smaller force of Canadians. The arrangement is unusual. German commanders like General Johannes Blaskowitz retain administrative authority over their own troops, while the disarmament and evacuation takes place. It is a practical decision by the Canadian 2nd Infantry Division under General Charles Folks. They do not have the manpower to manage 150,000 prisoners without German cooperation, so they let German command structures remain intact. Bruno Dorfer deserted his U-boat unit in January 1945. He hid in Amsterdam through the final months of the war. Rainer Beck is the son of a Social Democratic father and a Jewish mother. He walked away from harbor defense duty in September 1944 and spent months in hiding with his sister in Amsterdam. Both men assumed that when the Canadians took over, they were safe. They walked up to Canadian soldiers to regularize their status. The Canadians had no separate facility for German deserters. Major Oliver Mace, acting commander of the Canadian regiment, orders them placed inside the German naval compound because, in his words, they were certainly Germans and we had no other place to put them. The Germans inside the compound recognized them immediately. At 10:05 in the morning on May 13th, Major J. Dennis Pierce of the Canadian 2nd Infantry Brigade sends a cable to his superiors. German Marine deserters being tried this morning. German commander intends to shoot them. The response from the Canadian chain of command is a question mark. May they do this? It is not a high-ranking Canadian officer who answers. It is General Blaskowitz, the surrendered German commander, who gives the approval. Inside the abandoned Ford Motor Company assembly plant on the outskirts of Amsterdam, 1,817 German Marines are assembled to watch. That is the entire population of the camp. A military lawyer named Marine Oberstabsrichter Wilhelm Kahn presides. Fregattenkapitän Alexander Stein, the German naval commander who runs the camp, regards the proceedings as a demonstration of his authority. The trial lasts roughly 15 minutes. Dorfer and Beck are represented by a German military lawyer, but the charges are desertion and Wehrkraftzersetzung, the Nazi-era offense of subverting military morale. The Canadians lend Stein 8 captured German rifles and a 3-ton truck from the Seaforth Highlanders of Canada. Captain Robert K. Swinton escorts the firing squad. At 1740 hours, 5:40 in the afternoon, 5 days after the unconditional surrender of the Third Reich, Bruno Dorfer and Rainer Beck are shot against an air raid shelter wall outside the camp. The war is over, the regime is gone, but the machine kept running for 5 more days. When the story became public in 1966 through Der Spiegel investigations, Stein is unrepentant. The Nazi military courts-martial were not officially abolished by the Allied Control Council until August 20th, 1946, 15 months after the German surrender. In 1966, a German regional court in Landshut reviewed the death sentences carried out by Hübner at Remagen and issued posthumous acquittals for the men he had killed. In 2002, and again in 2009, the German Bundestag passed bills suspending the verdicts against Wehrmacht soldiers executed for desertion and homosexual activity. Germany recognized officially that these men were not criminals. They were victims of a legal system that had been weaponized by a state that was dying and wanted company. The monument to German deserters erected in Ulm in 1988 reads, "Desertion is not reprehensible. War is." There are shallow graves in the Westerwald where Hans Scheller and his colleagues were buried without ceremony on March 11, 1945. The German federal government reinstated their families' pension rights after the war. But in 1966, a regional court at Landshut formally reviewed what Hübner had done and ruled those executions unlawful. Hübner himself was tried after the war by a German court in Koblenz and sentenced to 4 years in prison. He served part of it. He died in Lemgo on February 28, 1965. He never expressed regret. Somewhere in the National Archives in Ottawa, there is a Canadian military cable dated May 13, 1945. The language is bureaucratic, quiet, and horrible. It reads, "German Marines in Amsterdam have picked up some of their own deserters. They have been tried by military law and sentenced to be shot. May they do this?" The answer to that cable was yes. The bodies of Dorfer and Beck were buried without markers. Rainer Beck, the half-Jewish man who had deserted to avoid being killed for what his mother was, died by a German firing squad 5 days after the country that wanted him dead had already ceased to exist. The sign on his chest read, "Deserter." The irony that a man shot by the Wehrmacht for cowardice was the same man who had defied the Nazi state for months. Hiding in plain sight in occupied Amsterdam seems to have occurred to no one in authority at the time. It occurred to no one because the machine did not think. It only shot.